Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. This is going to be a fact-filled, little bit of legalese, lots of acronyms. This is going to be quite intense, so please take notes. There will be a test later, I'm kidding. But keep in mind is exactly what Greg was saying. This is advice, this is not legally binding. We're all in a bit of a state of a flux, so we don't really know really where we're going, to be honest. So you all know that we're supposed to be doing something on the 31st of October, maybe, or maybe not. So we're going to basically present different scenarios today. We're going to talk about what happens if there's a deal, what happens if there's an extension, what happens if there's no deal, and try to put some meat on the bones around some of those things. We also are going to welcome your questions. We've made time at the end of every session for that. If you have a really burning question sort of in the middle, do give me a wave and I'll see if I can fit you in. We also have some people who know we're coming to them in the audience, so we're going to do that as well. I sort of think of this as like a buffet at a drive-in. You know, you're going to see a lot of dishes that are on offer, but we're not sure whether we're going to actually be able to eat any of them, depending on where we are with Brexit. So anyway,
there may not be any food anyway.
There may not be any food. That is also a problem, or medicine, but let's stay with media. And hey, we could just end up, as like Norway. We just be part of the EEA, which, in case you don't know, is the European Economic Area, which hopefully we'll still be part of even after all this is over. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Jack Powell is next to me. He's Senior Policy Analyst at the BFI. Obviously, the BFI is the administrator of the Young Audiences Content Fund, which you all know about. And Jack is knowledgeable about all things BFI and YAG. And next to him, we have Robert Specterman Green. He is from the DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport. He's the Director of Media and Creative Industries. So this is the man who actually knows as much as anyone about what's going on. So, yes.
I'll just add one more thing to
Yes.
that, which is that the BFI, as well as kind of administering the Young Audiences Content Fund, we also house the media desk of Creative Europe, Desk UK. So many of you may know my colleagues Agnieszka and Francesca, who are there to advise anybody that's looking to apply for any of the funding strands that are run out of the media programme.
Which hopefully they will still be some funding strands run out of the media program. Yes, good edit on that, Jack. So Robert, if I could get you to start, if you could take us through kind of where we stand in terms of the Brexit process and how this relates to the European funding from the Media Fund, which of course ends in 2020, and all that Media Fund supports. I mean, where kind of are we with this? As much as you can tell us.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm also grateful to Greg for the disclaimers that he explained at the beginning, because I just want to emphasise I am a civil servant and not a politician. I can give an version of events, but all of you probably know as much about where things may go as I do, based on the various commentaries that there are at the moment. I'm not a politician. I will tell you as much as I can. My objective is to be as helpful as I can within the constraints of what I can say and what I know. But I'm also here to listen to you and to be a funnel to feed back your opinions, your concerns to the government machinery as we work through this process. So I guess my basic plea is don't shoot the messenger and be nice to me. I am indeed Director for Media and Creative Industries in DCMS, so my portfolio covers all of the creative industry subsectors, including television, radio, film, animation, games, etc., and the journalism sector as well. So where are we? Obviously, the Prime Minister concluded an agreement, a deal so-called, with the European Council. But until that deal has been ratified both by the UK Parliament and by the European Parliament, then all scenarios remain on the table, including both a negotiated settlement, a deal, with the implementation period that comes with that, but also a no-deal scenario as well, if the parliaments fail to ratify that. The Prime Minister has also sent a request as mandated by law to the European Council for an extension to the 31st of October deadline. And until the point at which the European Union grants such an extension, then the legal default remains that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union without a deal. So that's why, as sometimes colleagues ask me, notwithstanding the Ben Act, which would appear to exclude the possibility of a no deal, legally speaking, we still have to prepare for all possible scenarios. Whilst it may be entertaining and interesting to speculate on what might happen, I will leave that to the pundits. You can all read the papers, listen to the news, etc., etc. So we do need to talk about both kinds of outcomes. What happens in relation to funding, and principally, I guess we're here to talk about the Creative Europe Media Fund in a deal scenario and in a no-deal scenario. So I wasn't sure, actually, Kate, whether you wanted Jack to talk about the deal and I can talk a bit more about no deal, if that's
Well, I think
helpful.
we wanted you to set it up first, and Jack was going to come in with a little extra information. Can you do
Sure.
deal or?
Yeah.
Yes.
I can do my best at any rate. So if we have a deal with the implementation period as currently envisaged, which would last until the end of December 2020, then the simple headline is that nothing changes. So UK projects remain eligible for all EU funding programmes, including Creative Europe Media. And you should continue bidding to that fund until the end of 2020. If we have well, let me come to what happens then after 2020, because
We'll do that in a second.
Okay, you'd like to come back to that?
Do you want to,
Well, I'd simply say that is that's where you start getting into greater degrees of uncertainty, because what happens after 2020 will depend on whatever the agreement may be that the UK strikes with the EU as to its future relationship. The political declaration, which was agreed alongside the withdrawal deal, did make provision at very high-level terms for continued participation by the United Kingdom in EU funding programmes.
Yeah.
It didn't go into the specifics of those programmes, but it did at least provide for the possibility for agreement on principles and contributions. And so if we have a deal, at the end of but by the end of the implementation period, one outcome is that an agreement is reached which includes a decision to continue participating in Creative Europe. Of course, there remains a scenario whereby we agree the withdrawal agreement now, including an implementation period until the end of December 2020, but the parties fail to agree the terms of their relationship, and so we are back into what we might colloquially describe once again as a no-deal scenario. In which case we find ourselves in the same position as we do were there to be no deal now by the 31st of October, namely that there will be no automatic continuation of the United Kingdom's participation in EU funding programmes. And indeed, logic would suggest that if everything has fallen down, then the in principle statements of the political declaration would also not apply. And so we would no longer be eligible to participate in Creative Europe Media, and then there would be some domestic policy choices which we can talk about.
so there's no automatic
on.
participation, but we might be able to negotiate some participation, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, I think if there is a deal and now and in December 2020, then in principle provisions are there, and that's all potentially for the taking. But if there's no deal either now or at the end of 2020, then those fall away. And so you either have a deal or you don't. You either negotiate some outcome involving participation in EU funding programmes, or you don't. It's to put it very simply.
So Jack, do you have something to add at this point? In other words, you're involved in some of these negotiations. How are we setting ourselves up to make sure that we can try to participate if we can.
So, I guess the thing that I would add is, as Robert has said, in the case that we do get a deal, and a further deal is kind of struck by 2020, there's the option of us looking to continue to participate in Creative Europe for the successor programme, which will run 2021 to 2027. That programme is currently being designed by the European Union itself, and it's worth noting that it has been designed specifically to allow third country participation. So that means even if you're not in the European Union, you can, if you make a financial contribution, take part in it. So from the European Union side, there is still very much the potential for participation should the stars align for us. With regard to what happens in a deal scenario in the business as usual, scenario, it is just that everything continues as it does now. The Creative Europe Desk UK will still be there to advise on potential applications. Calls will continue in the same way they do now. So if you are interested in bidding in for money through the TV production fund, through the development fund, if you're interested in participating in any of the training schemes, eligibility is exactly as it is now. It's also worth mentioning that if you have if you've agreed a kind of a funding relationship with the Creative Europe programme by 2020, even if your payments are due to continue after 2020, after the end of that programme, they will continue. So you will get your money until the final payment.
So as long as you have your deal in place before the end of the year?
Before the end of December 2020.
December 2020. Okay. All right. And in terms of the skills and stuff and the training, how about if somebody wants to go to Cartoon Forum or something?
Okay, so
can they still do that?
So in a deal scenario, yeah, absolutely, we would continue to be eligible in the same way. So Cartoon Forum obviously is an event where anybody that has a project that they want to kind of pitch for funding and investment for, if they're selected, they do this presentation, and hopefully it's a way of kind of courting additional investment. If the UK is continuing to participate in Creative Europe, our projects will still be eligible.
Okay, so how about if we've got a no deal? I mean, what happens then?
Yeah, so I think we'll come on to talking about the multilateral benefits of Creative Europe in a bit, but with things like Cartoon Forum, UK participants would be able to attend, but you wouldn't be eligible to be selected as one of the people presenting. So you can kind of go and sit in the audience, but you won't have the spotlight on you.
Yeah, but also you can't do co-production deals, really, can you? Or could you? Could you pitch and say, "I'd like to be a co-producer"? Not really, because you can't tap into European funds.
There's still ways of co-producing outside of the Creative Europe framework. It's just kind of it's where you sit within the kind of the structure of the event itself that will change.
So another question I had here was about the media fund is time limited. So if there's a Brexit extension, does that impact it? Does that mean that you said we're already involved in the new one, the one that's coming? But if there's a Brexit extension, does that mean we're going to have more input into the next fund, the next creative fund?
So, if there is an extension, we will continue to participate in Creative Europe up until whenever that kind of deadline becomes. So, as many of you may know, the requested extension to the deadline, which now stands at 31st of October, was to extend it to 31st of January. So, if that extension is granted by the European Union, we continue to participate as normal, regardless of deal or no deal, up until that point. It's worth noting that there are about 6 additional media calls for funding until then. As Robert noted, the advice of the Creative Europe Desk, and I believe the UK government as well, is to continue to apply for those funds, because if there is an opportunity to you kind of grab that investment while we're eligible, we absolutely encourage you to do it. And the desk stands ready to help you with those applications.
So Robert, a no deal scenario would take us to quite a different place. So what do you see as the alternatives to the media fund? Are there things that the government is thinking about, or the DCMS is thinking about putting in place to fill the gap, so to speak?
So before I answer that question,
Yes.
could I just supplement something that Jack said? which is to mention the government guarantee,
Yes.
which we have put in place to offer protection for current recipients of all European programmes in the form of a guarantee. I know it's not a complete solution for media participants, but it does mean that if you're already in the system, if you've been deemed eligible for funding under the programme, then the guarantee will cover you, will cover direct UK beneficiaries of funding only. That's not EU distributors, for example. So it provides a partial guarantee, I recognise, but a guarantee nonetheless. And what will be really helpful for us is to have a complete picture of who is in the system already. So if you're applying, then you should notify us, or you're already eligible, please notify DCMS or the desk, because that will help us administer the guarantee if we find ourselves
So in other
in
words,
those
so even
circumstances.
though you've just said that as long as we apply before December 2020, it's all going to be fine, we can still access these funds, you're now saying the government's going to guarantee this as well?
So this is.
It seems like belt and bootstraps, or
The
belt and
guarantee.
braces.
The guarantee relates to a no-deal scenario.
Oh, no deal scenario.
Yeah, as
Okay.
opposed to a deal scenario.
I tell you, it's hard to keep
Yes.
going straight. Okay,
Yes.
so no deal means that you're saying we will still guarantee that money.
If you've already been
If you've
considered
already in the
eligible.
system.
Yeah.
And you've been granted the money, or you're eligible for the money, you will guarantee that
Yes.
money. Okay. And how much money do you think you're going to have to guarantee at this point? As you say, you need a full list, but I mean, do you know where we are?
Well, it depends on the number of
Depends.
eligible projects.
Okay.
I mean, at the moment, it's the fund, it's the programme which
Yeah.
deems eligibility, not the
Yeah.
UK government.
Well, that's a good thing that you did that. Was that hard to get through?
Everything is challenging to get through, particularly when it involves money.
Poor Robert.
There is another factor here, which is the Commission has made a further offer to the United Kingdom to participate in the budget discussions on the budget for 2020, building on the same offer it made earlier in the year for participation in 2019. The government is looking at that proposal. If it agrees to it, then it means that we can continue to access Creative Europe throughout 2020 in return for contributing to the 2020 budget. That may still apply in a no-deal scenario, even where, therefore, we've not had a negotiated outcome.
But the government would have to agree to fund their portion, or our portion.
The government has to agree to contribute to the overall budget of the EU in order to benefit.
So what do you think
in
the
return.
possibility of that is?
It's not helpful for me to comment on the possibilities because I simply don't know. So it would be pure speculation. But you asked me about where we go in the no-deal scenario. So I did want to step back just before I get into the specifics to re-emphasise the government's support for the creative industries. We absolutely recognise the very important economic and broader contribution that you will make. We were referring earlier to the role that the creative industries played in the recent economic statistics and preventing the recession. And my Secretary of State only yesterday was participating in the launch of a report by the CBI emphasising very explicitly the role of the creative industry sector to the economy, and she made it very clear that she recognises the contribution that you all make, and that those aren't just words. The government has, as I hope you are aware, put in place real concrete measures to support the industry, be that through the various creative sector tax reliefs, our support for the National Film and Television School, the launch of the UK Games Fund, the contestable fund that we were talking about before, as well as continuing to support the system of public service broadcasting. So this is a government, and I think the current Prime Minister personally is very supportive of the creative industries, and we have no intention that I'm aware of changing our view that this is a really valuable sector which we should cherish, not just because of its economic contribution, but because of its broader the broader enriching role it plays to society, and its relative resilience in face of the fourth industrial revolution as well.
So in terms of that,
spiel out the way.
That's good. No, that's good. And we're glad you're supportive. So what kind of replacement domestic funding do you think?
So it's very clear from the discussions that I have with all of my stakeholders that the Creative Europe Media Fund is very highly valued. It plays a very important role and helps you do the work you do and be as successful as you do. I cannot today give you any guarantees one way or the other what might continue or may not continue. But we do start from that default position of a very positive outlook for this sector. We are, of course, planning or thinking about what kind of options there may be in terms of whether you could come up with some kind of domestic alternative, how you could continue to replicate the relationships which exists within that fund. And I'm interested in all of your ideas, actually, as well as to what, if we were to have the possibility of a domestic alternative in place, what that could look like, because the Creative Europe Media Fund is quite a complex beast. It's got a number of funding strands, a number of interdependencies, and so it's unlikely that we're able to replicate all facets and features of that scheme on a purely domestic level. So I would find it useful to know what are the particular aspects of the way that the programme currently works that you would especially like to see continue, so that we can feed that into the thinking that we're doing at an official level, because there's been no political decision as I speak. So I'd welcome your inputs into that. And I mean, I'll return to my slightly flippant comment earlier that obviously anything to do with money always leads to some quite challenging negotiations within government. This isn't just within the gift of me or the DCMS, but we will need to secure agreement across government as well.
So already you've put out two pleas. One, who's applying to the Creative Media Fund, and secondly, what people have in terms of their ideas of what they would like to have continue. So I think we should somehow gather that up, Greg, either orally in the Q&A, or maybe people write stuff down. Okay, so he's asked for that, so if you have ideas, let's write that down. Okay, so in terms of what's going to replace it, as you say, you don't really know, you're looking at options, maybe replicate some of the relationships, maybe some alternative funding, and you're looking for other ideas.
That's about as far as I can go today, other than to clarify one point, which is that the contestable fund we do not see as the successor, should there be one. These are two distinct instruments with different objectives, and I wouldn't want you to think that the way that we're thinking is that the contestable fund is already the solution to this situation. Okay,
so that because there is a certain amount of thinking in the industry that, well, we've got the YAC, it's a lot of money, it's 57 million, 57 million, you know, they're fine. So you're saying that's not the feeling, at least among the civil servants?
So this fund was designed to target a very specific objective, which is to provide more new, innovative British content to young audiences. That is very different from what the Creative Europe Media Fund aims to do. And one is not a replacement for the other.
Good, we're very glad to hear that, by the way. Yes. Take that back to the minister and make sure she knows that too. Okay, and then, so, I mean, Jack, when you hear what he's saying, is there something that you can add to that? Do you think that there are some alternatives that you guys have already come up with, or is there something we need to discuss here, or?
So, yeah, there's a couple of things that Robert's mentioned that I think it's kind of useful to unpack a bit. Firstly, I want to say, kind of as the administrator of the Creative Europe Media Fund, DCMS has been incredibly supportive in working on potential alternatives in a no deal scenario. It's something that we continue to talk about. We obviously kind of want to impress. whenever we're having these conversations, what we think would be best for the sector. And one of the things that Robert picks up, which I think is a really important point for us to think about, and hopefully this discussion will kind of help us go into it, is what elements of the Creative Europe programme would be difficult to replicate, or do we need to think more about how we replicate beyond kind of streams of investment? That idea of multilateralism here is really important. So it's one thing to kind of have kind of a cash replacement, but one of the benefits of Creative Europe and kind of continued participation in it, as we see it, is the access it gives you to a network of peers and other people working in the industry from right around Europe. An example of where we have to really think about how we kind of provide potential mitigations or kind of support is around things like Cartoon Forum, as you said, right? So Cartoon Forum is a brilliant example of where, we'd still be able to attend and there's still benefit in that, but there's, by virtue of being part of this club of, 20 plus participants, you have access there to the whole network, the whole audience that attends if you were selected to show your project. You have connections through that network to people that really understand markets in different member states that you wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise. There are also kind of other benefits to Creative Europe, like the fact that there's the Creative Europe stand and kind of mentoring scheme at different festivals. So as many of you may know, if because of our participation in Creative Europe, if you go to a festival and you don't have, or go to a market and you don't have your own stand, you have the ability to use the Creative Europe stand to conduct your meetings. You also have access to people who can advise on kind of how to navigate the market or the festival, or the
so
best way to go about it.
Is there a place to make some kind of bilateral agreement where if we have no deal, can we just negotiate with Creative Europe and say, hey, we'd still like to be part of the club?
Mm-hmm. I guess what I would say is just in terms of like the political reality after a no deal, how easy is going to negotiations? I think it might be.
The other thing that comes up for me is it's access to your peers and understanding markets, but it's also access to talent and being able to pull in a writer or an animator or even a grip or whatever it is that you need.
It definitely plugs you into big networks that would be difficult to just kind of replicate domestically.
Is there any? Do you think there's anything that you? Do you see that that's a problem, Robert? That this sort of plugging into networks, and is there any way to fix that? I don't know. I guess it depends how much they like us after this.
Well, I am confident.
Can the creative industries rise above some of the political challenges and say, hey, there's a cultural, cultural relationship that somehow supersedes some of this politics?
Well, I'm confident that stakeholders across the creative industries already have deep and rich relationships that would survive any political scenario. Obviously, the political constructs provide some formal frameworks and channels for dialogue, exchange and funding, but even without those, I'm sure that you'll continue speaking to your counterparts. There are also, it's important to remember, other frameworks which don't depend on the European, on membership of the European Union. So there's the ECTT, which the European Convention on Transfrontier Television, which is a Council of Europe agreement securing UK content under European Works status, which will continue after we've left the European Union in either a deal or a no-deal scenario, and the European Commission has confirmed that. I know that there are some stories out there at the moment suggesting that is not the case, but let me clarify that now. It is. UK content will still count as European works. Yeah. There is the other impossible acronym, the ECCC, the European Convention on Cinematographic Co-Production, which is currently undergoing ratification in this country, and that provides another framework for co-production as well. And then, of course, the government has made clear its desire to conclude trade agreements with a number of countries around the world, and we might expect there to be provisions within those in this space. Then the big open question is, in a deal scenario, what is going to be the nature of our future relationship, in particular when it comes to the cultural creative sectors, because we recognise that funding streams are important, but they're not the only channel on which we can continue to engage with our European friends. There are many other forms of dialogue and discussion that can persist. And, in a deal scenario, that's obviously easier to negotiate, but it isn't necessarily impossible to do that also in a no-deal scenario. Maybe it won't be quite as comprehensive at the level of the 27, but there will continue to be exchange bilaterally or multilaterally in a different way, I'm sure.
I think that's really important, don't you, Jack? That
For sure. And I think, one of the things that we've touched on is, part of kind of demonstrating that we're still completely open for cultural collaboration sits within the industry itself, right? Kind of going out there and taking that message to our colleagues right across Europe.
Now,
there's one other thing I forgot to mention, which is the cultural test. So we have already amended the cultural tests in the United Kingdom, which you'll know is a key determining factor for testing eligibility for our tax reliefs. We have already amended our cultural tests so that post-exit all EEA criteria, contributions are eligible for earning points within the test. And we are working with other EU member states to try and get them to do the same, so that UK contributors continue to be recognised. In theory, you would hope that people recognise the incentives that this poses. We certainly have to, in terms of continuing to attract work being produced in this country because of its broader benefits. I would hope that European partners recognise the same incentives.
And just to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but I think these are issues that are going to be picked up in the next few.
We have a whole section on tax and stuff, but it's really good that you told about the cultural test, because that is obviously where we start from when we start talking about that. I think I want to open it up to the audience. So do you all have any questions? So we've got one here. Could we bring a mic down to Genevieve? Yeah. Put your hand up so she knows where you are. There you are.
Hi. A few of us have got some applications into Creative Europe at the moment.
Could you just say who you are, Genevieve? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Genevieve Dexter, Serious Lunch. So a number of us have applications which a decision is pending, we hope, by the end of October. So I think TV programming, single project, slate development funding. And so whilst we're waiting for that news, if it doesn't come before next Thursday, has that decision already been made within Creative Europe? I.e., when does that decision date from, and what happens if we have a no deal to all those applications that are now pending?
So I can take that. So just to kind of echo what Robert said about the HMT, the Treasury guarantee, that applies to projects that have that funding agreement in place. In a no-deal scenario, say if it kicked in, the agreement has to be there kind of by October the 31st. With regard to whether the decision has been made or not, it's basically the decision gets passed back to the European Commission and is made internally there. So the desk, as we have at BFI, kind of advises on applications before they go in, but then it is kind of fed into that central machine, and what happens with regard to the process is not completely transparent to us. I think with regard to those applications where there is some ambiguity as to eligibility on the guarantee, it's something that we continue to kind of make a case for on what will happen.
Okay, so if Genevieve doesn't get her green light before October 31st, what happens? Is that when the government guarantee kicks in?
Again, that's where you have to have the confirmation by then.
You have to have the confirmation by the October 31st.
So is Creative Europe hoping to get those decisions out by next Thursday?
I think we've definitely made the case a very, very many times to get them through as soon as possible. Absolutely.
I think that was the whip coming out and saying, get back and get that desk working. Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Let me ask Nick Harvey from Illuminated Films. You've benefited from the Creative Europe Fund. Nick's over there. If you could hand him the mic, the white shirt. Yeah, she's coming. So you benefited from the Creative Europe Fund. Or how worried are you about the future here? You're a producer, animator,
yes,
right?
as an independent producer, having the media fund has been crucial for us to develop all sorts of projects over the years and get our productions made and onto TV. For us, it will certainly be, a no-deal scenario is a scary concept. But with any sort of deal, having it until at least 2020 is something to help, and hopefully we can negotiate something there. You're asking about elements of the media programme. One thing that's really important for us and what is great about the media funding and the process you go through, the application is, there's a lot of detail. You have to really think about the whole idea of your project, which is crucial in actually getting it there and getting awarded, which actually makes you help you think about your idea, and you can pick out elements early on and see where you need to improve. But once you're through the gate, as I say, once you've been awarded, they are very good at letting you get on with it as a producer, and you develop it as you go. There's no going back and forth and them trying to...
They don't give you notes.
Yeah, exactly. So you can be creative and really take that forward, and that's where creative media really help in doing that.
So in terms of something maybe replacing the Creative Media Fund, if we get to that point, you would like something like that, whereas
Indeed,
the application up front is pretty detailed. They really ask you to cross your T's, mind your P's and Q's, but then once they gave you the money, it's kind of go and do it.
There's obviously a final audit, and you submit your final development project, but that is it. There's no going back and then back and forth. And because, in terms of the awards, when they're given out, being on the other side of actually evaluating the projects that are given to media, it's evaluated by companies and independent people across Europe, all producers in one way or another, and so they know what they're doing and know what they see as a topic.
Yeah. Another question? Sorry, didn't see that. Yeah.
Tony Humphries from DIT, Screen Specialist, but also a recipient of about €450,000 from the Media Fund as a producer a few years ago. One thing that I'd like to ask is, we were talking about deal or no deal situations and the way that we would be able to perhaps cover that from a UK point of view. The big issue that we've had generally with Brexit going forward is the uncertainty. So what contingency, what efforts going into, if there is the no deal situation, the potential hiatus for producers between that decision being made and a resolution?
That's you, Robert.
It's a very good question. The government guarantee is part of the answer, although I recognise that that's backward looking. My honest response is there will be, so we have begun some of the thinking internally at official level about what the options might be, but there will have to be further work done. And so I think it would be wrong of me to suggest that immediately there will be some new provision in place from day one. That is partly what the guarantee is designed to address, but it won't fill all of the gap, particularly obviously for new projects, before we have decided what, if anything, would be brought forward.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point. There's almost like there's going to be a gap between what things that have happened or projects that have been funded and things that would like to then move into, I've now got my idea ready, I'd like to get some funding, and there's going to be this sort of vacuum. It could be quite a long vacuum, depending on... In other words, this industry is going to continue to come up with ideas, and they
Yes.
continue to need funding. It's not like we're just going to stop and down tools.
I'm not in a position today to say the gap will be X weeks, Y weeks, X months, or Y months. We understand, I can give you this assurance, we in the department understand the value of this fund and the difference that it makes. And so, there is already good fundamentals for arguing the case that there should be some kind of future provision. But it will depend, there are so many other dependencies in terms of other demands on finances, the political views at the time, so on and so forth. As a civil servant, all I can do is reassure you that we understand the situation, that we will do our very best to expedite decisions as quickly as we can, and then get in place whatever measures that have been deemed appropriate. But I'm unable today to tell you that there will be immediate provision beyond that which I've already described in terms of
No, I
the
think
guarantee.
that's understandable. So my point there is the message to producers should be you have to be at your creative best, because everybody in this room is used to being able to construct
Yes.
co-production relationships and finding the money from wherever they need to. But I think the message there is that if, in the case of a hiatus, we need to continue getting on with it. From our own point of view.
I mean, in a way, you almost need to start looking at other countries possibly as places to go looking. Maybe this is a moment when we start looking towards, I don't know, China, the US. Greg, you have a question?
And if it comes to alternatives to involvement in schemes like Cartoon Forum, of course, the Children's Media Conference is always there and ready to step in. We're already running an international market funded by DIT. So we're there. Working with Animation UK and others, we could provide some form of alternative if it were necessary. And a second point, we touched very, very briefly on training and how the Media Fund gives access to certain training events. I don't think it's a massively used thing for training in this country. But I would say that I know that Screen Skills and the Animation Skills Council, for example, would, if they were here, would wish to say, don't forget, there is an animation training levy. It goes hand in hand with the tax incentive. They want to encourage people to pay that levy. They want to encourage people to come up with great ideas for animation training in particular. And in fact, we're another plug. We're staging an event in Manchester in a couple of weeks' time, at which they will have a forum where CEOs from animation companies will talk about their training needs and the schemes that they want to run forward.
So, I mean, this has been great. Robert Spectrum Green has given us, really as much, I think, as you can tell us about what's going on. And we've
possibly
heard also,
even a bit more.
Yeah, we've also heard from Jack Powell. We need to wrap this up. Is there anybody else who wants to say anything to Robert that he can take back to his minister or his department that you think you want to let him know? No? Yes?
I have. Oh, sorry.
You have one. Okay.
Hugh Walters, Industry Media. Just to make a pretty obvious point, really, that Creative Europe doesn't fully fund programs. So typically, on an animation project, it will fund a maximum of 12.5% of the budget.
Yep.
And that has two consequences. First of all, that producers have to be very, very savvy in raising the balance in co-production money. But in terms of UK PLC, what you're doing is effectively leveraging nearly 90% spend on top of the 12.5% that comes from Europe. And whatever comes in place of Creative Europe, where it's another version of Creative Europe which we can participate in, or a bespoke initiative from the UK government, I think that's really very, very valuable for the UK economy.
Yeah, I would just say on that, I mean, the point you make about kind of leveraging in additional funding is absolutely key to this whole discussion, and it's something that we in the BFI have very much impressed on DCMS. And as Robert says, from our discussions on that and impressing the kind of the spillover effects, as it were, of that investment, it's understood. I think it's making that case kind of across government that we kind of continue to push it. I would like to add one thing, if that's okay, just before we wrap up, which is just to signpost people to some resources that we have on this issue and on broader Brexit issues kind of beyond today. So the Creative Europe Desk UK has a kind of a page which sets out guidance on what is going on with Creative Europe funding, kind of in deal, no deal extension scenarios, and that's constantly updated. We also have a BFI Brexit page, which is at bfi.org.uk/Brexit, which takes you through what will happen on a range of screen sector related issues, both in deal and no deal scenarios. So on that we have information not only on the future of Creative Europe funding and other forms of European funding, we also go into things like co-productions, financing, things like VAT, movement of goods, movement of people, access to talent. It's all there, so I recommend you take a look at that. There's also an email address on there, which is brexitadvice@bfi.org.uk. Any Brexit-related questions you have, please send them through to us, and we will look at them and get back to you with a response on what Brexit might mean for your organisation, or with regard to the question that you ask.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jack. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And I really want to thank Robert for coming, and I know it's a bit intense because you're sort of, well, I can only say certain things, but we really appreciate your giving us your knowledge, because this is a bit of a scary time. So it's good to know that the government understands, the importance of this industry, that you're working hard to figure out ways to continue to support this industry going forward. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. And I need you to help me as well. So please share the information that I've asked for and help us to make the case for why some kind of support should continue, including through explaining the benefits that you've got from it as well.
Perfect. Okay, could you please join me in thanking our two panelists, Jack Powell and Robert Spector-Green. Thank you.